11 world capitals in the year 2300, we're gonna start off with London. London is known for its red telephone boxes and black cabs, so in 2300, I imagine that these will still be around, but maybe with some cool retro-futuristic modifications. Same with the double-decker buses. But what about the buildings? Well, I imagine that London will be a very, very dense city in the year 2300, so these small streets will be packed full of skyscrapers. And the reason for this is because sea levels will rise, which means that many coastal cities will have to densify to make room for all of the people who are going to be displaced by the rising waters. Now, next up we have Berlin. Now, Berlin is a very historic city, and I think that in 2300 they will want to preserve the historic buildings that are there now, such as the Brandenburg Gate. However, just like with London, Berlin will also need to densify due to rising sea levels, so I imagine that they will build these massive skyscrapers right outside of the city center. But they won't be allowed to build them in the city center because of, historical preservation. Next up, we have New York. Now, New York is already an extremely dense city, so I don't really imagine that it will change much in terms of density. However, what will change is the surrounding environment. You see, in the year 2300, the glaciers will have melted, which will mean that we will have a much warmer climate, but also that we will have less snow. So I imagine that Central Park in the year 2300 will probably look a lot different than it does today. Maybe there will be more green space, and maybe some of the trees will be a lot bigger. Then we have Moscow. Now, Moscow is a very large city, and it's also a very cold city. So I imagine that in the year 2300, they will have to keep the city very, very warm. To do this, they will use geothermal energy to heat up the city. And because of this, I imagine that Moscow in the year 2300 will be a very green city because they won't have to use fossil fuels to power their energy. Next up, we have Seoul. Now, Seoul is already a very technologically advanced city. In fact, it's one of the most technologically advanced cities in the entire world. So I imagine that in the year 2300, it will still be one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world. In fact, I imagine that Seoul in the year 2300 will look like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. It will be a city full of flying cars and robots. Next up, we have Tokyo. Now, Tokyo is another very densely populated city, so I imagine that it will look very similar to how it looks now, but maybe a bit more rundown. This is because in the year 2300, Tokyo will be over 1,000 years old, so I imagine that a lot of the buildings will be old and rundown. However, this will also be a good thing because it will mean that Tokyo will be very cheap to live in. Next up, we have Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam is a very historic city, but at the same time, it's also a very modern city. So I imagine that in the year 2300, it will still be one of the most modern cities in the world. In fact, I imagine that in the year 2300, Amsterdam will be completely car-free. All of the cars will have been replaced by bikes and public transportation. Next up, we have Beijing. Now, Beijing is already a very modern city, but in the year 2300, I imagine that it will be even more modern. In fact, I imagine that Beijing in the year 2300 will be the most technologically advanced city in the entire world. It will be a city full of skyscrapers and high-speed trains. Next up, we have Dublin. Now, Dublin is a very historic city, but at the same time, it's also a very modern city. So I imagine that in the year 2300, it will still be one of the most modern cities in the entire world. In fact, I imagine that in the year 2300, Dublin will be completely car-free. All of the cars will have been replaced by bikes and public transportation. Then we have New Delhi. Now, New Delhi is already a very densely populated city, but in the year 2300, I imagine that it will be even more densely populated. This is because India's population will explode in the next few decades. So I imagine that in the year 2300, New Delhi will be one of the most densely populated cities in the entire world. And finally, we have Paris. Now, Paris is known for its beautiful architecture. In fact, I would say that Paris is some of the most beautiful architecture in the entire world. So in 2300, I imagine that the French government will do everything they can to preserve this beautiful architecture. However, just like with all of the other capitals, Paris will have to densify due to rising sea levels. So I imagine that they will build these massive skyscrapers just outside of the city center. But they won't be allowed to build them in the city center because, it would just ruin the view. So yeah, that is how I think that the world capitals might look like in the year 2300. What do you think?